Well, I definitely think it's a space that, can improve. One, again, the cumbersome and automation and not having to recertify families every year and transition to a different model. So I think it's
Hmm.
definitely a place of policy that we should explore and advocate more.
We would appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It isn't. Thank you so much. Um, I think this fall, so we see a lot of potential in this proposal, and it aligns with conflicting um, rules that make government more efficient and maintains, the rigor in the compliance and monitoring side. And so I think collectively as a committee and as we move forward for next year's legislation, this is definitely a place that we can add and enhance in the proposal that we have prepared. And we plan to have these conversation with the county assessor and continue it here in the select committee as well. I think people are more open. I think the housing industry in general, I mean, going to an earlier point that you also said is like, we need a revamp. We need a revamp of the vision. We need a revamp of what, we need like a blank canvas because I don't think what we're doing now is working. And many of us in different phases of our life have been a recipient of some form without realizing, whether you bought your first home with a mortgage tax credit or first-time home buyer, down payment assistance, didn't really know the bigger picture. So I think number one is really redefining what the new homeownership and rental market, and what I like to call my own made-up term is the housing economic ladder, that the California housing model should be. What is the entry point, right, from homeless? I'm going to go all the way to homelessness, right? And the different types of homeless housing that we need, and the pool that can move up to transitional housing, and then the transitional housing into permanent affordable rental housing. And then they break off, there's many forks in the road as you're going up the housing economic ladder that I call. And then once you get to that rental opportunity, very few, right, are able to move on to affordable home ownership. So it's redefining that collectively as Californians and as legislators that we need to revamp it. And we need to revamp it because of what you said earlier, of what players can play in the sandbox. I've had the opportunity that my career has allowed me to practice in San Francisco County as a housing practitioner, in Alameda County and Contra Costa, and then serving at the California Housing Finance Agency Board, where I learned all about the state in different geographic areas. And there's disadvantage that I can say today that my 30-year career, we did not have the affordable, the biggest boom that happened in the Bay Area was in East County, where is my district, right? People fleeing Oakland, fleeing San Francisco, and creating other housing market problems for us that were unaddressed because we weren't ahead of the curve on affordability. So I think we also need to redefine that. Who gets to play in the sandbox, right? Where the money goes and where it equitably goes as we think of reform in financing and programs. I also think leaning on social program is not a space we want, a term we want to be using, because what I hear throughout California is, well, I'm going to go back. I had a recent graduate come to my office and say, there's something wrong here. I came out of poverty. I'm first gen everything, first gen to go to college, first gen to work. And here I am, did all what we call the right things to break a cycle of poverty, and I can't afford a home. And so I think there's more of us that identify that the middle class is struggling. And so as we're thinking of this model, I really think we shouldn't use the word social program because it offends people who have either come, had at one point were what we consider in the industry low income and made it to middle class, but they still don't feel like they are in the middle class category because of all the economic pressures happening, that we can't afford a home. We can't afford the down payment because the cost of energy, our education, all of the reasons that you all know that I don't need a lecture on. And so I think changing that name, in my humble opinion, is going to bring more people together. And what I would like to say is more generational housing, right? We have a different model now. It's no longer the two income households. It might be now that you graduate with your high school or your college friends and say, let's lump our money together. How can we buy a home what lending products are out there that allow us to buy a home, but we're building equity. The theme has to be of how do we build generational wealth that's not the traditional model, and getting away from terminology that is triggers for people that says, wait a minute, that sounds, social programs sound like the very, very low income and not the middle class. And I'm tired of supporting social programs when I'm struggling myself. So that, to me, that term already, and not knowing in depth of it, is already like would turn off my ears, even as a housing practitioner. So I think we should look at it from a different lens. Again, generational housing, and that missing middle is the workforce, right? That I think we could get more buy-in on a program. And then thinking big versus small, the big players, and a vision that allows, like the Central Valley constantly gets left out of the housing, and our needs are so different from Northern to Central to Southern California. And I don't think there's a united goal and vision. And then certain cities, the bigger cities, the suburbs and the Central Valley get gobbled up by, Southern California, or even in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And so it's hard to get people engaged in this dialogue in reimagining what housing programs can look like when we haven't been beneficiaries to it. And I can speak that for the East Bay and the Bay Area, that San Francisco has benefited and is struggling, and even being the recipient in front and center of the advocacy, it has been at the expense of the greater Bay Area. And so, I think it's exciting work, but I think there's a lot more to tease out on this, where it's going to bring more of that missing middle and the middle class to want to embark on a multi-generational, and it's a different term. I don't even want to say social housing, because I think it's a big trigger for people who the majority are struggling now. And when we don't see them the way we need to see them, we're not going to get buy-in. But that's just my humble opinion in that space. And I think this is what this dialogue is for, right? Is like, we need a rebrand. I'm glad to, I didn't see you there, but I was there as well at the housing summit this weekend, or last week. I don't even know what day we were in, but
on Friday night.
On Friday night, thank you.
Yeah.
My colleague, Assemblymember Wicks, her story of, I think most people didn't even realize her housing journey, right, which really colors of how she feels. And my story that I always like to tell people is that someone like myself with, that came from a migrant family that it took 3 generations before I became a homeowner, right? That's not very much different from where we are today. It's not that it's taking that long, and that as your story, I grew up in a single parent household, right? In affordable housing, and breaking those cycles of poverty requires a different kind of lens, because it's not just creating the housing, is how are we breaking these cycles of poverty to uplift communities, especially communities of color throughout the state of California. And when you are the first gen, that there is so many other obstacles that even when you do get your housing, how to protect that wealth, that you're not over leveraging yourself when every day you have predatory lending happening to you, to say, hey, this is a great idea to pull equity out of your home. And then you're dealing with the foreclosure problem, right? It's not just getting people into homes, it's maintaining people there so that they can age in space. And then the reverse end of the housing affordability on the spectrum of seniors that maybe they did pay off their home, and freeing up so much inventory. We don't have anywhere to move our aging parents, even if there was an opportunity, right, to free up the bigger single family homes like the suburbs that I live in. That is huge housing inventory. We don't have rehabilitation loans, right? A lot of these homes now, like in the East Bay where I live, and I'm sure my colleague probably has we're built at the boom of the infrastructure booms of housing, are now nearing 50 or 60 years old, or if not, people don't have the money to rehabilitate the homes, right? So now we're ending with more substandard housing on the market because there isn't products. Lenders don't want to lend. And where are we as a state of California not forcing lenders to create products that we can back to, renovate these units so they don't become substandard and the people don't get their housing units condemned because the city then does enforcement? Like, the whole model just needs revamping general. And this is what the Housing Select Committee is about, is giving solid recommendations, changing the narrative to meet today's needs of everyone, right? The fact that today my story of growing up in a single parent household, a grandparents who would never achieved home ownership, is still very present in California, that 30% of California families are single parent households. There is no way
That's right.
they are going to be able to afford the mortgages that command the sale prices that are here. So, and our model's different, that we have longer commute times. I would never buy, if I had to advise myself 20 years ago, I wouldn't have bought the land that I have now as much as I love it, because of the commute, the time factor of maintenance, right? Our lifestyles are different. We don't need these big homes on, acreage anymore. The model has changed for people when you have 2-hour commutes, and even our building community needs to change that. Yeah. And I still see that, like, why are we not going up in more density? We're still creating these big homes when who can afford this? It's a very select few. And so I think collectively, and I hope, again, with my colleague, that we are able to do this and communicate this as we roll out our recommendations, and working with you all and our staff of, we need a rebranding, we need a bigger picture, and collectively why we were very successful last year in housing bills. We shouldn't be running 2,000 bills a year, right? And we should be more surgical, I guess, for a lack of a better term, on what kind of bills we're going to run that is actually going to have a multi-prong approach to deal with all these housing pressures and deal with the various. We have to protect at this moment the middle class and re-engineer outward. It can't be the other way, how programs and even the social programs have been to take care of we have to take care of them, right? But if our middle class, who have the bulk of the economic burden, aren't being taken care of, there's not going to be political will to pass housing bonds statewide or at the county level. And so I really hope that we all can collectively work and revamp. It sounds like we're in alignment of, we need a revamp of this and have a different image of how more inclusive this can be, to really inject the enthusiasm of what the multi-generational housing model and the new housing model is going to look like for Californians to achieve homeownership and affordable rental markets is very critical. And I think there's no argument that our aging population deserve to age with dignity and grace, and that we all don't have a problem. I would hope to say that all Californians feel we need to create the funding mechanism to make sure that every senior in the state of California can age in dignity, whether they want to age at home or have the supportive housing environments that they can do that. And back on the front end, that any young adult professional coming out of college, that they can aspire and dream to be able to have a home ownership in the not so distant. And right now, both of those possibilities are simply gone, that we arrive to middle age with no asset or wealth building. And so I think there's a lot of space to work in here. So thank you.
I really agree. I'm really inspired. I think you're totally right. I think it has to be addressed in this vein of generationally and thinking about, the problem through the lens of people and not just technical fixes. And not piecemeal. I mean, there's a million things that are going right now around the insurance problem, which is a huge problem, and I agree. But we're tackling all the problems in this piecemeal fashion when really there is a bigger picture that we need to understand, from elders all the way to young people.
I just want to pause to thank my colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think from that lens that, when we become practitioners, it's really easy to get in the weeds and lose sight that I've done it, right? Like, I've worked at redevelopment agencies and different housing and community development. And it's a space that we're all conditioned and trained that it's supposed to produce this outcome. It's broken. It doesn't work anymore. And we all fight for a piece of the pie for funding. And I think we all have to come with the lens now that this whole model needs a reset. And it's no longer just fighting for dollars at a regional approach, because that's also been catastrophic to the overall revamping, right? Because, different counties, and not to pick on San Francisco, but, that's a space that I practiced for, over a decade, and I know it well when redevelopment was there and worked in the housing and community development. that you can see the inequities because of the organization being able to, and the sophistication that San Francisco moved. And then you can look on just on the other side of the state, whether north or south or to the east, in the inequity that we don't have the housing developers out in the Central Valley, right? And so I think when we start to re-engineer this from an equitability perspective and bringing our community lenders, I was recently meeting with lenders in the space of the smaller lending space, and they're like, we're interested in the space. Like, we can't compete with the Wells Fargo, you know, the credit unions. Where is a market that we can occupy to be the lenders? And so we have people that want to play in that space. And I think it's just finding them and recreating everyone being excited. And I think, not to be political, but everything is political, I think this is going to also be colored of who our next governor is going to be, that we need leadership. And we need a legislature that is going to be precise and collectively work together on what, whether you're a housing practitioner or not, and I sit on the housing committee, is that we get a lot of sponsored bills and we get a lot of housing bills, but we're all over. I think we're just throwing things at the canvas and not being strategic of what reforms we really need, and we're doing tweaks. And I think with this select committee, my colleague, our goal is to set a new foundation and do a hard pivot in the housing, in the finance, and redefining who we are and who we're trying to house. And it's a multi-generational housing lens of going up that housing economic ladder.
I like the rebranding. I'm going to start using it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Did you guys have any further questions? But I mean, this was really helpful, and I think this is a space we definitely need to tease out on the rebranding and getting more people on board and fired up a housing in a different way than the traditional model has happened in the last several decades. And coming as someone that came off the city council and came off a planning commission, I think there's multi-pronged pieces, right? That depending what planning commission you have and what city council you have, that's how your planning department is going to react, right?
Yes.
And so there has to be a degree of separation from that process to get rid of the unknown there. And because I saw it in my years of practicing and building that it influenced, right? Whether you could pick up your code, your plan, do a plan check, and it met all the criteria, the politics would always interfere and delay a project. And we have to figure out, it seems like this would be a space, adopting something like that for California and having the municipalities understand that it's a game changer. We have to change. Small cities, like, for example, I'm gonna use my own little city, at 36,000, most of our stuff were built out in infill, but a lot of infill opportunity, rezoning, upsizing lots, but only 3 planners, right? And even for a city that is not so little, right? And 1 planning director. And, you know, timing is everything. That if, whether it's an 8-plex or, you know, 50 units, it's all about the timing, how quick you can get out of a plan check. And then I think communities like mine are traumatized because when the guardrails weren't there, developers did abuse, especially, you know, in the further East County that you go on where it was more ag and open space. There were a lot of abuses that happened. And so now people, between urban limit lines and really keeping tight control of local control, is because there were generations that got traumatized with developments that weren't sensitive to the community or integrated into and brought, you know, they came and developed and left monstrosities that did not fit in the community. But I think we're past that, right? Like, we've learned so much in land use. We've learned so much in community engagement. And we can't be shy about, it's time to recalibrate and change how our planning activities happening at the municipality. And we have to come down with a heavy hammer now with the cities and saying, this isn't okay, right? That an 8-plex takes 2 years to get entitled. This isn't okay that markets change quarterly, if not, you know, monthly. And a builder, it's all about the financing. And so I think creating a framework of what we think is reasonable for a land use development and entitlement process is not unreasonable for us to move into a model like, British Columbia has done. And we should champion that. And I also think the state should provide resources, whether, it's through this model and to help cities. And we also have to explore different ways that infrastructure should not be on the backs of developers, period. And that is an outdated model. And so how are we going to change? Because that's the first, as a former elected on a city council, is like, we can't let all this development happen. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to? So let's, I have an example where we did a small infill, and that infill was going in a blighted area, an industrial transitioning area of my community. And we forced the developer to do the sewage piping from that development to, Timbuktu, which was like, $200,000 to the city. That didn't make a big deal, but to that small developer, that was a big deal, right? And so I can cite endless projects where infrastructure almost made developers walk away or barely cash flowed, to get through their construction loan. And we have to stop doing that. It should not be. We are in the business to build housing. It's a fundamental need. It's a human right. And it should not be at the expense of those practitioners who decide to be developers. And we have villainized that industry, that they are responsible for the full infrastructure improvement of our cities versus re-engineering. How do we finance infrastructure?
Because that is the public infrastructure. And I think the challenge, you've got all your PG&Es, your SMUDs, your water companies, and they're like, we can't charge existing ratepayers for these improvements, but we can charge you. Right. So the system is dialed in to make sure that it's the last guy in is going to foot the bill for the dinner.
And so I think, the Vancouver model is something that we should tease out more through the select committee and elevate it. And I'm happy to work with my colleague. I think, he will most likely watch this and will convene, and I think we should find a path forward. I also think this is an opportunity to go very bold and start talking, because as the naysayers come out, if they see that we're talking about infrastructure, that this is not the way on the backs of developers, whether you're big or small, irrelevant, making a profit, not, that's all irrelevant, right? We as legislators have a responsibility to build up the housing stock in California and to house, socially be responsible in housing all income groups of California. And our current system is simply not working and producing the outcomes. And we have to mitigate the uncertainty in this space. And there's a lot of uncertainty that starts at step one of pulling your permit and trying to go through that process. So I think there is space, and we also have to bring the subject matter experts of how do we float an infrastructure bond to deal with communities who are going to simply look at this and oppose it from that lens that they're not going to have the resources and funds for the infrastructure. So,
which of course goes back to tax increment potentially and the future of saying yes to new housing because it means more incremental taxes.
Correct.
So then you have the virtuous cycle set up to receive additional tax, increased tax, incremental taxes to reinvest. Because part of the challenge too is that, really, the cost of infrastructure, and by the way, a friend of mine does social housing in Europe, and I asked once, I said, do you have to pay for all the infrastructure every time you do a project? And they're like, no, that's what the government does. Yeah. The government makes sure that all those pipes are where they need to be, sized the way they need to be. It's not off the backs of the developers. They just build the housing. They get to plug into something that actually works.
And I think, too, that I think this select committee is, again, it's starting with a new housing canvas and redefining these terms, right? Because we can't legislate. I'm just in my year and a half, and I already feel that it's very fragmented, right? Like, we all care about it because we've all legislated around it, whether you've been here 1 year or 10 years. And so what I'm calling for is that this select committee create a unified multi-prong approach of really getting to the crux and meat and potatoes of what are the barriers. And infrastructure is a problem. The streamlined permitting is a problem. And then working with our community stakeholders at the local level to get buy-in in that. And I think this is what this vehicle is for, is to have a path. And I'm really excited. I had no idea. It makes all sense. As much as I visited Vancouver, that explains a lot, of what we have seen there in the last decade. So I think that's something we should definitely continue to dialogue and figure out how we put it in as part of a recommendation from the select committee, and try to get traction on that. So I'm really excited about that opportunity to be able to do that and collaborate in that way with you.
Thank you. Well, we're happy to be a resource and bring others to the table. Thank you for making the time today.
Thank you. Well, I know that I definitely signed on with other colleagues to support, this. We did a letter from my office. And, the whole theme of all these panels today is, again, we have to, the model is broken. It does not work. It's outdated, right? Over-regulating and not streamlining even this process is becoming a hindrance and not allowing developments to enter into the construction phase with that financial stability that we all know is so critical up front. And so I think this is also, to paint, this picture of this space as well, that this committee should also be leaning into reforms in that space with HCD and supporting how to streamline it and make applications a lot stronger in the financial viability of these developments as well. Because again, up front, that a lot of people forget that it's not just securing the loan, it's getting, or even being there at the groundbreaking, it's that stabilization to making sure that you enter into your construction drawdowns with that stability, not knowing, oh my gosh, I gotta do step 1, 2, and 3 before I'm able to tap into these other funds. And so removing that uncertainty in the financial market, I think is really critical in a space that I think this committee can definitely lean into. And again, it kind of bleeds into the previous panels that how we're doing business is not functional, it's not efficient, and it's outdated.
Couldn't have summed it up better. Literally, mic drop. I think as you hear over time and time, we consistently say that the system is fragmented, that it's broken. We need to be able to streamline. We need to ensure that we are investing resources, but also really practicing preventative measures. Looking at how do we first start with ensuring that we are setting up developers for success so that we can get the ultimate benefit of having those units affordable, available, and ready to go for those families in need.
And it goes also to a previous panel discussion when we try to get smaller developers to play. They can't play in the space because they can't finance that and carry that. So we're, and we have a lot of infill projects, right? That get squeezed out of that competitive space. And so the name of the game is having multiple solutions, multiple players delivering different various housing solutions, right? Whether it's multifamily, multi-generational housing, whatever the vibe's going to be on the housing products, but we need to have an environment that allows people to play in these different environments. And our lending is the old traditional model from back in the 30s, right? So I think when we start talking from that lens, that we're trying to fix things in an outdated model where we had different incomes, when we had different market forces. And it's all a new game. And I think looking and approaching these problems in this lens of trying to reform and revamping is going to put this committee, the select committee, to be putting more solid recommendations in that space. So you don't have any disagreement with me that that does not work, right? I sat on CalFHA for over a decade, right? And even we get robotic, right? This is step 1 to get to second base, to third. And as you become complacent and no one questions, this isn't working for today's needs. And we are all contributors to that space as well, because we have conformed that this is how we as the state has set this up. And so I think it all needs to be revisited of, again, the sandbox needs to be cleared out, and we need to bring new toys into the sandbox to deliver, housing products and financing and the deliverables, which is creating the housing opportunities for Californians. So, I look forward to, beyond the letter, to continuing to support in that space and, collaborate as we prepare our recommendations moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. We love to be a thought partner and continue in this space to see this forward. So thank you for the opportunity to talk
No,
about this
we're going to
important
nerd
topic.
out and vibe on that. We got Mark here, and so we, when in my absence, we're going to do this because this isn't just a hearing to, address the obvious. This is a committee that we are committed. The speaker's committed to delivering results and being comfortable of saying, this model is not working. We're beyond just throwing tools at it. This model is simply broken. We need to start fresh and bring new tools to the sandbox. So, I mean, that's where I'm at with this committee, and I know my colleague is as well. So thank you for being here, and I hope this is the first of many more interactions we have today to rethink this.
Absolutely. You can't get rid of me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to close our committee. I just want to thank everyone. One, I appreciate the flexibility and accommodation that you all lended in the grace. That session lasted longer than we anticipated. The people's business sometimes is really unpredictable, but today, we also had continued people's business here. And so I'm very grateful that you took the time to show up and be part of this dialogue and to really support and encourage thoughtful policy dialogue and reform that needs to happen around housing opportunities for California and all the players involved, from the developers to our city partners to the financial institutions and obviously the constituents that we serve, that we are here to solve a very complex problem of clearing up the pipeline and, moving people through the housing economic ladder, whatever entry point, may be for people in California. So I'm really excited. We're going on a year that we've been working on the select committee and have had various panels. I think this is one of the most engaging that actually brought us a lot of different solutions to incorporate into our report. So I think the next phase is we have a few more public hearings that we will continue, and I want to assure you that your time today is going to result in a well-documented report that we actually execute on some plans. And you may regret that we end up calling you and saying we need community partners and the subject matter experts to move this forward and shepherd it. But I'm very hopeful between my colleague and myself to move forward with the speaker and leadership to deliver some tangible outcomes and recarving a new path, right? Like, this path is not working, and it's time to pave a new road. And this is what the Select Committee is here to do. So thank you all for your time today and your testimony, and we look forward to continue to work with you.